A school security guard noticed a girl crying alone behind the gym every afternoon. One day, he decided to investigate, and what he found made his blood run cold. Frank Dawson had walked the perimeter of Hollow Creek High School every weekday for the past 9 years. It was part habit, part duty, a routine he'd settled into after retiring from 32 years in the military police. At 64, he wasn't the kind to sit still. His bones ached if he stayed seated too long. His mind wandered if the days passed without purpose. So he kept moving. His shift started at 6:30 a.m. and ended at 4:30 in the afternoon, with a final sweep of the campus before the custodial staff locked everything down. It was during that final round, when the hallways were quiet, the students long gone, and the sun stretched low across the parking lot, that Frank first noticed her. A girl, alone, behind the gym. It was a Tuesday. He had just finished checking the cafeteria doors when he turned the corner and caught sight of her sitting on the edge of the low brick wall near the old equipment shed. Her back to him, knees pulled up to her chest. The back of her hoodie was navy blue, her jeans scuffed at the hem. Her shoulders shook slightly. Frank paused. He considered calling out, but something in her posture stopped him. Instead, he waited, watched. After a minute, the girl stood and slipped away around the side of the building, disappearing toward the student parking lot. He didn't think much of it then. Maybe she'd missed her ride. Maybe she was just decompressing after a hard day. Kids had all sorts of reasons for needing space. But the next day, she was there again. And the day after that, and the day after that. By Friday, Frank had memorized her routine. She left the building around 3:12 p.m., about 5 minutes after the final bell. Never with a friend, always alone. She walked briskly past the science wing, past the dumpster, then cut sharply behind the gym. Always the same path. She'd sit on the low wall, hidden from view unless you were specifically walking that stretch of sidewalk between the shed and the rear fence. No cameras pointed that direction. Too many trees, too much shade. It was a blind spot. Frank would walk past slowly, never directly approaching. He didn't want to spook her, but he started noting her appearance: small frame, brown hair, pale complexion. He checked the student database when he got back to the office. Her name was Emily Carson, freshman, 14, recently transferred from a school in Ohio. Parent contact listed Mark Whitmore, legal guardian. No emergency contact besides a grandmother in another state. He made a note in his log. 3:16 p.m., the student Carson, E, behind gym again, visibly distressed, no approach. The following Monday, it rained. Hard. The kind of early spring storm that flooded the parking lot, drains and soaked through the soles of your shoes in minutes. Frank did his rounds anyway. Poncho zipped, cap pulled low. When he reached the gym, he expected the girl to be gone. No one in their right mind would sit out there in weather like this. But she was there, soaked, hunched beneath a narrow overhang near the shed, shivering. He approached slowly. "Miss Carson." She looked up sharply, eyes red, lips trembling. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself. "I'm fine," she said quickly. "Just waiting for my ride." "In the rain." "Et Turine." She looked away. "He's late." Frank hesitated. "Do you want to come inside, dry off?" She shook her head. "It's better if I wait here." There was something in her voice that made his stomach tighten. A practiced politeness, a learned stillness. "I'll be around if you need anything," he said gently. She didn't respond. That evening, Frank filed another log entry. 3:14 p.m., Carson, E, behind gym in heavy rain, refused to come inside, excused waiting for ride, appeared shaken, logged and notified VP's office. He never heard back. By Thursday, he started noticing new things. Emily would sometimes glance over her shoulder abruptly, as if startled. Once, Frank saw her check something under the bench, reach beneath it with careful fingers, then quickly retract her hand. Another time, she froze when a loud car passed the fence line. And always, she wiped her face before standing up, as if erasing something. On Friday, Frank made a decision. He waited until she left, then returned to the bench after the grounds were empty. The air was crisp with the smell of cut grass and the last clinging chill of winter. He crouched down beside the wall where she always sat, looked under the bench. At first, nothing. Then, tucked behind a loose brick, he found it. A small, resealable plastic pouch. Inside a half-empty blister pack of birth control pills. Frank stared at it, heart pounding. He turned the pack over in his hands. No name, no prescription label, just the pills, some taken, some missing, all hidden. He straightened slowly. This wasn't a teenage mistake. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. Frank Dawson sat in his small security office near the front entrance of Hollow Creek High, the pill pack resting on the desk in front of him like something radioactive. He had placed it on a paper towel, not wanting to smudge or contaminate it, though he wasn't sure why. It wasn't a crime scene. Not yet, but it felt like evidence. He reached for the landline, dialing the extension to the assistant principal's office. It rang 5 times before a voice picked up dry, tired, and faintly distracted. "Mr. Dawson, what can I do for you?" It was Vice Principal Hendricks. Frank explained what he'd seen over the last 2 weeks, Emily Carson's repeated presence behind the gym, her demeanor, the crying, the behavior that didn't feel like simple homesickness. He described how she refused to come inside even in the pouring rain. Then, finally, he told him about the birth control pills. There was a pause. "Was she with anyone?" "No," Frank replied. "Always alone." Another pause. "Well, we can't jump to conclusions. Teenagers are complicated. A lot of them get on the pill for acne these days. It doesn't necessarily mean she was hiding them," Frank interrupted, voice low. "Behind the brickwork." "I see," Hendricks said. "Well, I'll make a note and talk to the counselor. Maybe loop in her homeroom teacher. See if she's noticed anything. Thanks for bringing it to my attention." And just like that, the call ended. No questions, no follow-up, just bureaucracy wrapped in concern. Frank stared at the receiver for a long moment before gently setting it down. That night, he couldn't sleep. Not because of what he'd found, but because of what it implied. There were only a few reasons a girl that age would be hiding something like that, and none of them were good. He'd spent decades learning how to read subtlety body language, eye contact, silence. Emily's silence had a shape to it, and that shape wasn't fear of math tests or mean girls. It was something deeper. He knew it in his bones. The next day, Frank changed his routine. Instead of looping the campus in his usual order, he timed his patrol to be behind the gym at exactly 3:15. He walked slower, made noise, coughed once so she'd hear him coming. Emily was already there, curled in her usual spot, arms wrapped around her knees. When she saw him, she stiffened. "Afternoon," Frank said gently. She nodded but didn't speak. "Rough day?" he asked. She shrugged. "You know, when I was your age, I used to sit behind our barn. No one ever thought to look there. It was the only place I could cry without someone asking what was wrong." Emily looked up. Her face was pale, lips pressed into a thin line. "Sometimes it helps to talk," Frank offered. "Not always, but sometimes." "I'm fine," she said, barely above a whisper. "You don't look fine." "It's none of your business," she snapped. Frank nodded slowly. "Maybe not, but when someone hides medication behind a wall and cries every day, it stops being just their business." Her eyes widened. I found them yesterday. I didn't touch them. Just looked." Emily stood suddenly. "I have to go." "Emily, don't tell anyone," she said, voice shaking. "Please." He watched her walk away, shoulders tense, arms locked to her sides like she was holding herself in place. That night, Frank didn't go home right after his shift. He sat in his office, the school dark and quiet around him. He opened his old laptop, typed in the name from the back of the pill pack, and confirmed what he already suspected. The dosage was low, the type commonly prescribed for contraceptive purposes. Not acne, not cycle regulation, not something a girl hides under bricks unless she's terrified someone will find out. The next morning, he called her homeroom teacher. Miss Claire Monroe was in her early 30s, warm but no nonsense. Frank had always respected how she handled students firm but fair. Emily, she said. When Frank asked, yeah, she's quiet, withdrawn, doesn't talk much, but she turns in her homework, never causes trouble. I tried to pair her with some girls in class for group work, but she always declines. Says she prefers to work alone. Anything unusual lately? 2 days ago, she left during fourth period, asked to go to the nurse but never showed up. We found her asleep in the theater wing, in the back row under a pile of coats. Did you report it? Principal Daniels said not to make a fuss, that some kids need time to adjust. Frank sighed. Everything pointed to the same thing people seeing, but not looking, hearing, but not listening. He knew what came next. He'd have to follow this further than he was supposed to, not because it was part of the job, but because no one else would. He pulled up the student roster again, scanned for Emily's guardian contact. The name Mark Whitmore came up, along with a number, stepfather, no mother listed, just one line, mother temporarily out of state per legal custody documentation. That night, as Frank made his final sweep of the empty hallways, he passed the gym and looked toward the bench. She wasn't there, and somehow, that worried him more than anything. By Monday, Emily hadn't been seen on campus for 3 days. There was no absence note in the system, no parent call. Frank Dawson checked the sign-in logs. Nothing. He stopped by the attendance office and asked casually if anyone had followed up. The clerk shrugged. Some kids are just flaky the first year, Frank pressed, but she waved him off. We only start making calls after 5 days. That didn't sit right. He remembered the look on Emily's face, cornered, like a stray animal, and that message behind her words, don't tell anyone. So he didn't call the school again. He started digging on his own. He used the public employee terminal in the main office during his lunch break. He looked up Mark Whitmore in the county property registry and found a modest single-story house on the south end of town, near a liquor store and a pawn shop. No vehicles registered in his name, no employment history listed in school records. Then Frank searched court records. One sealed family services case 5 years ago, no details listed. 2 citations for disorderly conduct, a DUI from 2019. No formal charges of abuse, but a pattern. Not enough for law enforcement, but more than enough for Frank. That afternoon, he called the number listed as Mark Whitmore's contact. It rang 7 times before someone picked up. A low voice answered, Yeah, Mr. Whitmore. This is Frank Dawson, school security at Hollow Creek High. I was hoping to talk about your stepdaughter, Emily. She's been absent the last few days, and we haven't heard from anyone. There was a pause, and then she's sick. Is there a note you could provide for the school? Maybe a doctor's surgery or... She'll be back tomorrow. Click. Frank pulled the phone away and stared at the screen. He didn't like the man's tone. The next day, Emily returned. She looked even thinner than before, her hair slightly unkempt, her eyes glassy. She moved like someone trying not to be seen. Frank watched from the parking lot as she walked from the car to the school doors. Mark Whitmore didn't get out, didn't wave, just stared ahead and drove off the moment the passenger door slammed shut. Frank turned to re-enter the building, but not before jotting down the license plate. By Wednesday, the weather turned unusually cold for spring. The sky sagged with clouds and the wind carried a bite. Still, Emily made her usual detour behind the gym after last bell. Frank waited until she'd been back there 5 minutes before approaching. This time, she didn't look startled when he rounded the corner. You came back, he said gently. She nodded. He stepped closer, hands in his jacket pockets. Did something happen last week? No, she said too quickly. Then, realizing how unconvincing that sounded, added, I was just sick. You didn't go to the nurse. Emily looked away. Frank crouched a few feet from the bench, not beside her, but close enough to show he was listening. You don't need to tell me everything, he said, but I need to know if you're safe. I'm fine. You keep saying that, But you hide behind the gym. You cry alone. You keep pills under bricks. And now you're missing school and lying about it. She stiffened. You said you wouldn't tell. I haven't, but you're scaring me, Emily. She didn't respond. Then softly as she whispered, you can't help. No, why not? He said if I talked to anyone, I'd regret it. Frank's jaw tightened. Who, he asked, even though he already knew. Emily stared at the ground. He said my mom wouldn't believe me, that she needs him, that she has the baby now, that I'm just extra. Frank felt something sharp twist in his chest. Does he hurt you? Emily didn't nod, didn't speak. But she blinked, and the way her lips trembled was answer enough. That night, Frank called in a favor. He had a friend, Tony Barker, who worked in Child Protective Services in the next county. They weren't close anymore, but they'd served together overseas, and Frank knew he could trust the man. He didn't give names at first, just described the situation in hypotheticals. Tony listened carefully, then said, you need to document everything. Dates, photos, conversations. If she confides in you, that's not nothing, but it's not enough. We need a report, physical evidence, something we can act on. Frank already had some of that, the pill pack, the log entries, the license plate, the call record, but he needed more. And fast. Because predators didn't wait. On Friday, the day started normally. But by 2:30 p.m., clouds had darkened the sky again and the wind had picked up. A thunderstorm was coming. At 3:12, Emily exited the side doors. At 3:14, Frank watched her from a distance, pretending to check the fence line. At 3:16, he saw a car pull around the far end of the school, not the pickup zone. It was Mark's sedan. Emily froze when she saw it. Frank saw her take a step backward, clutching her backpack like it was armor. Then she turned and ran. Not toward the doors, not toward help, but straight behind the gym. Frank's heart dropped, and he started running after her. Frank wasn't a man who ran often anymore. His knees had stiffened over the years, and his lungs no longer tolerated cold air like they used to. But that afternoon, as Emily disappeared behind the gym, propelled by something deeper than fear, Frank chased after her like he was back in uniform. By the time he rounded the corner, the wind was kicking up dust and small leaves, and thunder rumbled in the distance like a warning. Emily stood near the bench, arms wrapped tightly around her chest. Greg Whitmore's car had pulled up just beyond the fence, technically outside school property, but close enough to see, close enough to reach. Greg was out of the vehicle now, standing by the chain-link gate that maintenance staff sometimes left unlocked. His posture was too casual, his expression unreadable. Frank slowed as he approached Emily. She didn't turn. I didn't know he was picking me up, she said softly. Frank looked toward the fence. Greg noticed him now, nodded once, expression shifting into something almost smug. You don't have to go with him, Frank said. He's my guardian. That doesn't mean you're safe. Emily didn't reply. She stepped forward, then paused. Her feet stuck as if something inside her couldn't move. Greg raised his voice, not quite shouting, but loud enough to carry, Emily, let's go! Frank took a single step forward, placing himself slightly between Emily and the gate. Not fully, not confrontationally, but enough. She's still on school grounds, he said firmly. You're off property. I'll ask you to wait until dismissal protocol is followed. Greg's smile didn't reach his eyes. It's Friday. I told her mother I'd pick her up. Frank didn't budge. Then you can wait at the front like everyone else. Greg exhaled through his nose, a sharp puff of disdain. He turned without a word, returned to his car, and slammed the door harder than necessary. The vehicle reversed out with a screech, tires spitting gravel as he sped off. Only after the sound had faded did Frank look at Emily. Her hands were shaking. You don't have to talk, he said gently, but I need to know, has he hurt you? A pause. Then she nodded. Once. And that was enough. Frank didn't wait until the end of his shift. He didn't bother with a second call to the vice principal. He went directly to the local police substation. There, he met with Officer Lorraine Wells, A soft-spoken woman with sharp eyes and a notebook that never stopped moving. Frank brought everything he had: the log entries, the photos of the pill pack, the vehicle plate, and most importantly, Emily's whispered confession. Wells listened, asked questions, took notes. "You did the right thing," she said, glancing over the file. "If she confirmed any level of abuse, we can initiate a welfare check tonight. We'll need to involve child services, too." "Can I be there?" Frank asked. Wells looked at him for a moment. "Not in an official capacity, but if she trusts you, it might help." That evening, just before sunset, 2 patrol cars rolled to a stop in front of the one-story home listed as Emily's residence. Frank followed in his own vehicle, parking half a block away. From the sidewalk, he watched as officers approached the house, knocked firmly, and announced their presence. Greg opened the door. Frank couldn't hear the words, but he saw the posture shift, the annoyance, the way Greg leaned on the doorframe like the house belonged only to him. A few minutes later, a slim woman appeared, mid-30s, brown hair, tired eyes. Emily's mother. She'd been out of town until recently. Frank remembered from the school records. Greg had been listed as temporary guardian. Words were exchanged. Then the front door opened wider, and Frank saw her, Emily, standing in the hallway, frozen like a photograph. One of the officers knelt slightly to her level, speaking softly. Emily hesitated, then walked forward. She didn't look at Greg. She walked right past him and toward the patrol car. She wasn't taken into custody. Of course, she wasn't in trouble. But the car would take her to a safe house just for the night until child services conducted their interviews and determined what came next. Greg wasn't arrested that evening, not yet. But a file was opened, and the pieces were moving. Frank went home and sat in silence for a long time. He thought about how close this had come to being another headline. Another, "We never saw the signs." Another girl slipping between cracks. But someone had seen, and this time, someone had acted. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes. It wasn't over. But it had started. And sometimes that was the hardest part. Some people don't run. They just reshape the story before you can tell it. Frank Dawson knew something was wrong the moment he stepped into the main office on Monday morning. The secretary, usually chatty and half distracted by her crossword, barely looked at him. The assistant principal, Hendricks, emerged from his office not with a greeting, but with a clipboard and a thin, tight-lipped smile. "Mr. Dawson," and Hendricks said, "Can we speak in private?" Frank followed him without a word. Inside, the blinds were drawn. A mug of coffee sat untouched on the desk. Hendricks gestured for Frank to sit, but didn't wait for him to accept before starting. "We received a phone call Friday evening from Mr. Whitmore." Frank didn't blink. "Let me guess. He accused me of something. He said you've been following his stepdaughter, that you made her uncomfortable, that you called the police based on a personal vendetta." Frank's jaw tightened. "I reported signs of abuse. I handed you documentation 2 weeks ago. You told me you'd look into it." Hendricks held up a hand. "I'm not here to judge intent. I'm here to manage liability. The district doesn't want unnecessary exposure." "Exposure," Frank repeated flatly. "We appreciate your concern," Hendricks continued. "But as of now, the district has asked that you step back from any further involvement in the student's personal affairs." Frank stared at him. "You want me to walk away? I want you to do your job. Secure the building, monitor entry points, leave the child welfare issues to professionals." Frank stood slowly. "You've been sitting in that chair too long, Hendricks. You've forgotten what kids look like when they're in trouble." And then he walked out. That afternoon, Frank drove to the Hollow Creek Youth Center. It was a red brick building near the edge of town, where the trees started to outnumber houses and the street signs grew rusty. Emily had been placed there temporarily for her safety, according to Officer Wells. He waited in the small front lobby, filled out a visitor's form, and spoke with the intake manager, a kind woman named Rachel who seemed both overworked and quietly fierce. "We're screening contact lists carefully," she explained. "Emily's allowed to see staff and verified school personnel." Frank handed over his ID and offered to wait as long as necessary. After half an hour, Rachel returned, She said she'd like to see you. Emily looked better. Still pale, still quiet, but better. She wore a simple sweatshirt, her hair tied back in a ponytail. She sat across from Frank in a small interview room with bright lighting and one too many chairs. I heard what Greg told the school, she said quietly. Frank nodded. Doesn't matter. We're not letting this go. She looked at her hands. He always made people like him, gave gifts, told jokes. People think I'm just acting out. You're not. I know that now, she said. But for a long time I didn't. Frank waited. Then Emily added, he said if I ever said anything, he'd tell people I came on to him, that I lied to get attention, that I hated the baby and wanted to ruin their family. Frank's chest tightened. Did he hurt you when your mom wasn't around? Emily nodded. She left to take care of my little sister. She gave birth at my grandma's place. Greg stayed behind because of work. Did your mom ever suspect anything? I think she didn't want to. When Frank returned to his car, he found an envelope tucked under his windshield wiper. There was no return address, just a single sheet of paper inside, typed. You've made your point. Walk away while you still can. He read it twice, then folded it, slid it into his glove box, and drove to the only person who might have real answers. Emily's mother. Her name was Laura Carson. He found her through the hospital records publicly available if you knew where to look. She'd recently checked out of Willow Glen Medical Center after giving birth 2 weeks earlier. Frank drove to the address listed under her release paperwork, her mother's house, according to the records, a modest ranch-style home near the river. She opened the door in slippers and a worn hoodie, hair tied up, dark circles beneath her eyes. Mrs. Carson, Frank said. Her eyes narrowed. Who are you? My name is Frank Dawson. I work security at Hollow Creek High. She hesitated. Is this about Emily? I'm the one who called CPS. She didn't slam the door. She didn't cry. She just stepped back and let him in. Sometimes it takes a stranger to say what a family cannot. Laura Carson led Frank into a small, dim living room filled with the soft scent of baby powder and reheated coffee. A bassinet sat in the corner, draped in a pale yellow blanket. A faint cooing sound came from inside. She gestured to the couch. She's sleeping, Laura said, her voice almost a whisper. For now. Frank sat carefully on the edge of the cushion, hands resting on his knees. He didn't start with the accusations. He didn't mention the pills or the crying behind the gym or the look on Emily's face when she talked about her stepfather. Instead, he said, Emily's safe. Laura froze. I visited her today, Frank continued. She's at Hollow Creek Youth Center. She asked to see me. For a long moment, Laura didn't speak. Then she nodded slowly. I didn't know she was there until CPS called yesterday. They said someone from the school had reported Greg. I thought I assumed someone misunderstood something. But then, she trailed off. Frank waited. Laura rubbed her arms. When I called Greg after the CPS call, he said it was all lies. Said Emily was being dramatic, that she was jealous of the baby, that she made something up to get attention. Frank didn't flinch. Do you believe him? I wanted to. There it was bare. Painful truth. Laura swallowed hard. Greg took care of things when I couldn't. I had to go. I gave birth at my mom's, just like I did with Emily. He said he'd watch the house, keep Emily in school, make sure she ate. I thought. She covered her mouth, eyes glassy. I thought I was doing the right thing. You weren't wrong to trust someone, Frank said quietly. You were wrong about the man. Laura leaned forward, hands clasped. He didn't seem like a predator. He's charming, kind. He remembers birthdays. He helped my mom fix her roof. Even now, part of me wants to believe he's not capable of it. But part of you knows he is. She nodded slowly. Frank pulled the folded sheet from his jacket pocket, the one he'd found under his windshield. Laura took it with trembling fingers, read it once, then again. This is a threat. It's also fear, my Frank said. Fear of what comes next. Laura looked toward the bassinet. Emily told them about everything. She told me what she was ready to say. That's enough for now. Tears spilled over. I wasn't there, she whispered. She needed me, and I wasn't there. Frank didn't offer comfort. Not yet. Instead, he asked, when was the last time you looked her in the eye and asked if she was okay? Laura covered her face. That's what Greg counted on, Frank said, his voice still steady. Silence. Distance. Your love for your daughter, that was the tool he twisted. I want to see her. You should. And Greg, she asked, voice shaking, what if he denies everything? He already is, Frank said, but denial can't outlast evidence. That night, Laura drove to the youth center with Frank following behind. Rachel, the intake manager, welcomed her in. A counselor sat with them. So did Officer Wells. Emily walked into the room slowly, unsure, as if expecting to be blamed. Laura stood, and then she knelt. I'm sorry, she said. I should have seen it. Emily didn't speak at first. Then she said, I thought you wouldn't believe me. Laura's voice broke. I didn't want to believe it. That's different, and that's still my fault. They embraced, quietly, not as mother and child, but as two people trying to find a way back to each other after a long detour through silence. The next day, Officer Wells filed for a protective order against Greg Whitmore. The 3-week temporary custody of Emily was extended, and an investigation into Greg's background resumed. CPS confirmed that Greg had changed addresses and jobs multiple times across 3 states. In one prior case, an ex-girlfriend filed a complaint that went nowhere. Now it was being reopened. Principal Daniels, informed of these developments, reluctantly began an internal review under pressure from district leadership and an angry parent now publicly involved. Frank returned to school with a quiet welcome. No applause, no official statement, but staff nodded when he passed. A few teachers left apples on his desk. Miss Monroe, Emily's homeroom teacher, stopped by to say, you were right to keep pushing. Frank nodded. Next time. Let's not need a next time. A week later, Laura invited Frank to the house. It wasn't about closure. That wasn't the point. She wanted him to see something. Inside the living room, beside the bassinet, sat a framed photo. Not of the baby, not of the family, but of Emily, arms crossed, serious, strong. Beneath it, a note handwritten by Laura. She told the truth. That's more than most ever do. Truth is not enough. Sometimes, you have to say it louder than the lies. It started with a radio interview. Greg Whitmore's voice drifted through the car speakers of Hollow Creek residents during the Thursday morning commute. Calm, calculated, just enough sorrow. I loved Emily like my own, he said. This has all been a huge misunderstanding. A disgruntled school guard with a hero complex took things too far, and now my family's being torn apart. By noon, the podcast had picked it up. By 5 p.m., a local blogger ran a story titled Stepfather Speaks Out, framed by a school security guard. Frank read the headline over coffee that tasted like iron. He wasn't surprised. He'd seen it before. Predators didn't just hide behind charm, they wrapped themselves in it like armor. And when that was pierced, they struck back with the one weapon silence couldn't match: public doubt. The next day, when flyers appeared near the school parking lot, Frank Dawson crossed the line. Now a girl's family is broken. Is he really a hero or just obsessed? The school never claimed responsibility, neither did Greg. But Frank knew where it came from. Emily heard the whispers. Back at school under a protective order and supervised by staff at all times, she moved through the halls like a ghost. Students stared. Some teachers avoided her. One even remarked, just loud enough to be heard, some kids will say anything to get attention these days. Miss Monroe shut that down quickly. But the damage was done. The silence had returned, but it was meaner now. Meaner because it wore a smile. Frank found her behind the library steps, sitting cross-legged with her backpack between her knees. You okay? He asked. Emily shrugged. I thought it'd feel better. Telling. Getting away. Frank sat beside her. It will, not right away, but it will. She looked up. He's lying on the radio. I know. He said I was jealous of the baby. I know that's not true. I want to scream, she said, voice shaking. But I feel like even if I did, no one would hear me. Frank looked at her, really looked, and then said, "Then let's find a bigger room." That weekend, Ms. Monroe organized a private session for Emily to record her story. Not for court, not for law enforcement, for herself, for anyone who'd listen. They did it in the theater room, empty stage, curtains closed, just one spotlight above her. The video was simple, no edits, just a girl in a hoodie, sitting on a stool, talking softly into a microphone. "My name is Emily Carson. I'm 14, and this is what happened to me." She didn't cry. She didn't break. She just told the truth. The school board tried to block the video's release, said it would violate privacy rules, said it would incite drama, said it was irresponsible. But Laura had custody now, and Laura gave permission. The video went live on Monday. Within 48 hours, it had 60,000 views. Within 72, local parents began organizing to review how the district handles abuse reporting. By Friday, a regional journalist called Frank for comment. His answer was simple. "I listened, that's all, and I acted." Emily never wanted to be famous. She didn't want cameras or articles or applause. She just wanted the whispering to stop. And now, slowly, it was because she'd said it louder. And someone had finally listened. Greg Whitmore hired a new attorney, a sharper one, younger, cleaner cut, with a practiced smile and a talent for shifting narratives. On Tuesday morning, a formal statement appeared in the local paper, an open letter from Greg, dictated through his lawyer. "My stepdaughter has been deeply troubled since her father's incarceration. These recent accusations are not only false, but damaging to a fragile family. I ask the public to remain skeptical of sensationalism and let the legal process do its work." Frank read the article over a cup of black coffee in his truck. He folded the paper once, then twice, before tossing it into the footwell. That evening, the lawyer went further. In a live-streamed interview on a local community channel, he suggested that Emily's story had been coached by school staff, that she may have been manipulated by an overzealous guard looking for purpose. When asked directly about Frank, the lawyer smiled. "I'd be curious to know how often this man has involved himself in students' personal lives before this incident." The message was clear. Plant doubt, smear character, shift attention. The calls started coming again. One from a school board member asking for a coffee. One from Hendricks reminding Frank to respect the district's guidelines. One from a number with no ID at all. The voice distorted and raspy. "Let the girl go. You did enough. Don't make this worse." Frank kept a log of every call, time, number, message. He said nothing in return, but he wrote it all down. Meanwhile, Emily stayed quiet, not silent, but still. The video had given her power, but also exposure. Strangers approached her mother in grocery stores. A woman at the post office offered prayers while sliding a folded pamphlet across the counter. A neighbor put up a sign that read, "Due process matters too." Laura kept her head down. She stayed focused. She made dinner, attended therapy with Emily, took calls from investigators. And then, one Thursday afternoon, she received a call she never expected. A voice, nervous, male, early 20s. "I used to live with Greg," he said. "About 3 years ago. He was dating my mom." Laura's blood turned cold. The man said his name was Aaron. He'd been 16 at the time. Greg had moved in with his family for 7 months. At first, when things were fine, then Greg started taking his phone away, insisting on knowing where he was every hour. He'd call my mom and say I was disrespectful. He'd ground me, told her I needed discipline. One night, Aaron walked in on Greg, yelling at his little sister. The door was closed. The lights were off. She was crying. When Aaron confronted Greg, the man slapped him. Told him to get out. "I ran," Aaron said. "I slept in a friend's basement for 2 weeks before CPS got involved." His voice shook. But nobody believed me. My mom sided with him, said I was exaggerating. The report existed. It had been dismissed. No follow-up. Now Aaron was ready to testify. Frank drove him to the station personally. They sat in a room with Officer Wells, who took a formal statement. She made copies, cross-referenced addresses, dug up the closed case file. It was thin, a single paragraph, but it was enough because now there was a pattern. 3 days later, Greg Whitmore was arrested. Not for Emily's case yet, but for obstruction, for prior unreported conduct, for interfering with an active investigation. The arrest wasn't quiet. Local news filmed it. Emily watched it from the couch with her mother beside her. No one said anything, but when the cuffs clicked around Greg's wrists, she exhaled like it was the first time her lungs had ever worked. The school issued a brief statement. The district remains committed to student safety. We thank law enforcement for their diligence. Frank didn't smile. He didn't relax. But he allowed himself to breathe. Emily walked back into school the following week. Not everyone clapped. Not everyone changed. But the whispers shifted. Some kids looked away out of guilt instead of suspicion. Ms. Monroe assigned her a seat by the window. A girl named Renee passed her a note that read, "You're stronger than anyone I know." Emily smiled. A real one. Not forced, not calculated. Just hers. The envelope came on a Monday. No fanfare, just a plain manila package left in the school's mailroom, addressed in neat block print, Frank Dawson. Inside was a single sheet of paper, thick stock, watermarked, and a cover letter from a law firm in Harrisburg. The message was short, formal, and unmistakably hostile. Greg Whitmore was suing Frank for defamation of character, intentional emotional distress, and improper conduct with a minor. The letter claimed Frank had overstepped his role, had violated the boundaries of his position, and had inflicted psychological harm upon a vulnerable family. There was a phrase that stuck in Frank's throat like a splinter. A man with a savior complex must still follow rules. He read the letter twice, then set it down and stared at the far wall for a full 5 minutes. The district's lawyer called later that afternoon, said they were reviewing the claim, that it was standard practice in volatile cases like this. Frank asked a simple question, "Will the district support me?" There was a long pause. Then, "We can't guarantee legal representation unless this escalates." Escalates. Frank hung up and didn't say another word. He didn't tell Emily. He didn't tell Laura. Instead, he drove home that night with both hands locked on the wheel and the kind of silence that feels like a pressure cooker in your chest. At school the next day, things had shifted, subtly. A few staff members avoided eye contact. One custodian paused conversation when Frank entered the break room. The principal hadn't spoken to him in days. Not with words, but actions. Frank had learned were louder. By Thursday, rumors began to filter in that Frank had been inappropriately close to a student, that he had inserted himself into a fragile family, that he had manipulated Emily's story. Frank had faced worse in his life, but never while wearing a badge that said security in a place where kids were supposed to feel safe. He held his ground, logged his hours, watched the gates. But inside, something was shifting. Not fear, not guilt. Something more dangerous: isolation. Then something changed. At the end of the week, Ms. Monroe invited Frank into her classroom during lunch. She'd arranged chairs into a circle, 6 in total. Seated were 4 students, 2 parents, and Laura. "This isn't official," Miss Monroe said, "but we needed you to know we're with you." A mother spoke first. "My son told me what you did for Emily, and for him, too. He said he used to feel invisible until you started greeting him by name." Another student added, "You helped me find my inhaler that day I was having a panic attack behind the gym. No one else even looked for me." Laura didn't speak. She just placed her hand over Frank's, firm, steady. After the meeting, Frank stepped out into the hallway and found himself breathing easier for the first time all week. Later that evening, a post appeared online, an open letter signed by 17 parents and over 40 students. "We support Mr. Dawson. We believe Emily. We will not let silence win." It spread quickly. Within a day, over 100 comments. By the weekend, local news had picked it up. Then a city council member shared it. Then the mayor. Greg's legal team tried to walk it back, called it a procedural maneuver, not a personal attack. But the damage had already turned back around. At school on Monday, 3 students approached Frank during passing period. One of them handed him a small blue folder. Inside was a printed screenshot of the open letter and 64 handwritten signatures from students. At the bottom was someone had written in bold black ink, "Sometimes heroes don't wear capes. Sometimes they wear radios and walk the fence line." Frank closed the folder and smiled. Not because the fight was over, but because he finally knew. He wasn't fighting alone. The lawsuit was dropped without ceremony. No formal apology, no explanation. Just a quiet withdrawal filed with the county clerk on a rainy Wednesday morning. Frank found out from the district's lawyer, who sounded more relieved than proud. "It never had leg," and the man said, "but sometimes the threat is louder than the act." Frank didn't say anything. He hung up, went back to work. But the damage hadn't vanished just because the paper trail had. In the following days, the district launched a formal review, not of Frank, of the system. Why had a student shown visible signs of distress for weeks without intervention? Why had a school employee 3 times raised concerns that went nowhere? Why had the principal, the assistant principal, and the nurse all signed off on not enough cause for concern? Anonymous surveys were sent to staff. Meetings were held behind closed doors. A district investigator walked the halls with a notepad and a furrowed brow. People got quiet when Frank entered rooms again, but this time, it wasn't judgment. It was guilt. Miss Monroe was asked to provide a report. So was Frank. So was Laura. So was Emily. Emily's was the shortest. 1 paragraph. "I cried every day for 2 weeks. Mr. Dawson was the only person who asked why." That sentence was later quoted in the internal audit summary, bolded. By week's end, Vice Principal Hendricks was placed on administrative leave pending further review. The principal, Mr. Daniels, submitted a resignation to pursue other opportunities. The nurse retired early. None of it brought peace, but it brought motion. And sometimes that was enough. That Friday, Frank was called into a staff-wide meeting held in the auditorium. He expected the usual training modules, liability waivers, cafeteria updates. Instead, he found every seat filled: teachers, custodians, counselors, board members, students along the back wall. Laura sat near the front, baby asleep in her arms, Emily beside her. A board member took the podium and cleared her throat. "This year," she began, "we failed a student, not because we didn't care, but because we didn't pay attention fast enough. We want to begin making it right, and we want to start by acknowledging the person who refused to look away." She gestured toward Frank. He stood slowly, unsure. The applause was quiet at first, then rose, then settled into a stillness more powerful than sound. He was invited to say a few words. Frank didn't prepare speeches, but he stepped forward anyway. He took the mic, looked out over the crowd. "I don't have much to say," he said, "except this. The first time I saw Emily crying behind the gym, I thought maybe it wasn't my business. Kids cry. Life's hard. You learn to walk past it." He paused. "But something told me not to. Something told me to stop, to look. And that's all I did. I looked." He turned slightly, eyes scanning the room. "That's all anyone needs to do. Pay attention. Really pay attention. Because sometimes that's the only thing standing between someone and silence." He stepped back. The room stayed quiet. Then slowly, the applause began again. Not thunderous, but honest. Emily smiled. "A real one." Laura wiped her eyes. "And Frank." He went back to work. Just like always. But this time, the hallway didn't feel quite so lonely. Justice can be swift. Healing never is. Emily's return to school wasn't marked by a banner or balloons or a crowd clapping in the hallway. It was just a Tuesday. Rain tapped against the windows in the morning, and the clouds hung low like they had been told not to move. She stepped through the front doors at 7:48 a.m., her backpack slung tight against her shoulders, her mother walking a pace behind, hand gently guiding her forward. No one stared, but people noticed. A few whispered. 1 or 2 teachers made awkward eye contact before looking away. Frank saw her first. He was doing his usual rounds near the front lobby when the glass doors opened. Emily met his eyes. gave a faint nod, not a smile, not a greeting. Just a quiet acknowledgement between two people who had been through a storm together. Frank didn't wave, didn't speak. He just tipped his head and resumed his patrol. Emily's class schedule had been adjusted. Fewer students per room. Homeroom shifted to Mr. Monroe's class full-time. No gym for now. Therapy twice a week during fifth period. At lunch, she was allowed to sit in the library if she didn't want the cafeteria noise. She often took that option. Her presence was a whisper at first, passing through halls with the caution of someone who remembered what it felt like to be watched. But day by day, she sat straighter, answered questions in class, left her hoodie down instead of pulling it over her head. One afternoon, she even raised her hand to volunteer an answer about a poem. Miss Monroe said later she nearly cried right there in front of the whiteboard. Frank didn't speak to Emily often. That had never been their dynamic, but they saw each other daily, at the metal detectors in the morning, behind the gym at the end of his last sweep, near the east exit, where she waited for her mother at 3:45. Sometimes she said hi, sometimes she didn't. But every time she looked him in the eye, that was enough. Laura Carson adjusted to her new routine with a weariness that never quite faded. The baby woke every 2 hours. Work was limited to part-time, mostly remote. She still hadn't returned to the family house and wasn't sure she ever would. She had filed for emergency custody. Greg was still in custody. Awaiting formal charges, additional evidence was being collected. Aaron, the previous victim, had given multiple interviews. A former neighbor had come forward. Police were reviewing past allegations that had never stuck. The silence around Greg was unraveling, thread by thread. But that didn't mean things were fixed. Laura started seeing a therapist on her own. She and Emily went to family sessions every Thursday. There were awkward pauses, long silences, stilted attempts at reconnection, but they showed up every week. In one session, Emily said quietly, "I don't need you to say sorry every time. I just need you to stay." Laura nodded and stayed. Frank stayed too. Even when the internal audit was completed and he was cleared, even when a new security guard was hired to assist him, even when he was offered a promotion to oversee multiple schools, he'd turned it down. "I walk this fence line," he told the superintendent. "That's my job." She didn't argue. One afternoon, it went about 3 weeks after Emily's return, Frank was called to the auditorium, not for a crisis, not for a disciplinary issue, but for a student assembly about student voice and resilience. He stood in the wings as Mr. Monroe gave the opening remarks. Emily was seated in the front row, notebook in her lap. At the end of the presentation, they opened the floor to comments. Students trickled up. Some talked about anxiety, some about grief. One boy spoke about his dad leaving. A girl mentioned self-harm. Each one spoke as if testing the air, waiting to be dismissed, but no one laughed. No one rolled their eyes. Emily didn't go up, not until the very end. Then she stood, walked slowly to the microphone. No one moved. She said, "I used to think being invisible kept me safe, but it didn't. It just made it easier for people to ignore me. I'm not invisible anymore." She stepped down. Frank didn't clap. He just stood quietly at the back, arms folded, eyes steady. That night, he opened a drawer at home and pulled out the plastic bag where he'd kept the birth control pill pack. It had been entered into evidence months ago, returned now that the investigation had formalized into something bigger. He held it in his hand for a long time. Then he slid it into a small box, taped it shut, wrote a single word on the front, "Notice," and placed it back in the drawer. Because sometimes the most powerful thing you could do for a child was simply not look away. Sometimes the best thing you can do is make sure no one ever has to wait as long as she did. Frank Dawson was in the middle of writing an incident report about a freshman caught vaping in the boys' restroom when his phone buzzed. It wasn't unusual. The district had given him a new device when they expanded his role after the audit school security liaison. They called it a fancy title for a job he'd already been doing for years. The message was from a new hall monitor, Malik Jensen, a young man just 6 months into the job. Nervous, eager, still not used to the idea that high schoolers would rather die than tell you the truth. Frank read the message twice. Mr. Dawson, sorry to bother you. There's a student who's been sitting by the bleachers after school the last few days. Always alone. She's crying, but when I asked her about it, she said she was fine. I didn't want to push. Should I report it? Frank sat back in his chair. He knew the spot, the east side bleachers behind the track field, half hidden by an overgrown hedge, out of camera range unless the wind moved just right. He thought for a moment, then typed to Nasurin. Don't worry, I'll check it out. He signed off, grabbed his radio, and made his way out the side door. The sky was pale blue, fading toward dusk. It was quiet, most students gone. The sound of distant traffic, a low hum under the spring breeze. Frank took his time crossing the lot, boots heavy on the pavement. He didn't rush. There was no emergency. Not yet. But something in the text, something in the word crying moved differently inside his chest. When he rounded the corner, he saw her. Small frame, backpack still on, hoodie sleeves pulled over her hands. She was seated on the second row of the bleachers, face turned away, posture stiff. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, 10 feet away, letting his presence be known without making it a performance. Eventually, she turned. Her face was blotchy. She wiped at her nose with her sleeve, tried to smile, failed. I'm okay, she said automatically. Frank nodded. That's good to hear. She didn't say anything else. He took a step forward, then another. Stopped beside the bleacher rail, still a few feet down. I had a student once, he said, who used to sit behind the gym and cry every day. Never told anyone why. Most people walked past her. Some even called her dramatic. The girl's eyes flicked toward him, curious, suspicious. I didn't, he continued. And one day, she told me everything. Took months, but she did. He looked out at the field. The track was empty. Wind stirred the corner of a plastic bag caught on the fence. You don't have to tell me anything, he added, but I'll be here a while in case you want to. The girl hesitated. Then she said, It's my dad. Frank nodded, said nothing. He moved out a month ago, said he'd still come visit. He hasn't. Mom cries in the kitchen when she thinks I'm asleep. Frank stayed quiet. I don't want to tell anyone because I'm not hurt. I'm not in danger, just sad. Frank looked at her. Sad matters. She blinked fast. A tear fell. I don't know what to do with it. Frank walked a few steps closer, sat on the bench below her, far enough not to crowd her, close enough to anchor the moment. You don't have to do anything, he said. You just have to not carry it alone. She was quiet a long time. Then she whispered, Do you think it'll get better? Frank looked up at the sky. Eventually, he said, and until then, I'll walk this road every day, and you'll see me, and I'll see you, and that's how better starts. She didn't answer, but she didn't look away. Later that evening, Frank sat at his kitchen table, sipping lukewarm tea. His apartment was small, quiet. The walls were lined with framed pictures from a life that had once been louder military medals, faded Polaroids of his own kids now grown, a photo of the school cafeteria filled with students laughing. On the corner of his table sat a small wooden box. He opened it. Inside the sealed envelope labeled Notice, still untouched. He slid it aside and reached underneath. There, carefully folded, was a drawing pencil on lined paper. It was of a school, crude but recognizable. A tall man with a badge stood out front. Next to him, a small girl with a backpack and big eyes. The caption read, He saw me, EC. Frank unfolded it, smoothed the creases, and pinned it to the fridge with an old magnet. Then he turned out the kitchen light. The apartment settled into silence, but Frank didn't feel alone. Not anymore, because somewhere out there, a girl had told the truth, and another had just been heard. And tomorrow, someone else would cry behind a fence, or under a stairwell, or in the back of a hallway. And maybe, just maybe, Frank would be there too.